To the Keystone Biology Review on the theory of evolution. So first thing we need to consider is what actually is a scientific theory. In science, theory is going to be different than how you might use the term theory in a day-to-day setting. So in science, it's not just a guess, but this is going to be something that can help unify many different hypotheses about observations and experiments that have been done. So in science, a theory is a well-tested explanation of something in nature that we can use to actually make predictions about what is to become. And the observations that a theory is going to be using have to be able to be repeated and testable. And therefore, all of the evidence that we continue to accumulate about not only the fact that evolution occurs, but also the mechanism by how evolution occurs still holds validity for the theory of evolution. So starting with natural selection, and was first proposed by Charles Darwin. Natural selection is the mechanism for evolution, or a change over time. So a classic example here that we've been able to observe within a lifetime is the peppered moth example. During the turn of the Industrial Revolution, the birch trees went from a light pigment, with the light moths having the higher fitness, to dark, covered in soot, and now the light moths had a lower fitness because they were able to be picked off, and the dark moths had a higher camouflage and a higher fitness. So what has to be there in order for natural selection to work? First thing is you have to have differential fitness. So what is fitness? Fitness is going to be an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. So within a population, there have to be some organisms that are better able to survive and reproduce than others in their population. This is going to be courtesy of these advantageous traits that, again, are going to allow for an organism to survive and reproduce. We also call them adaptations. The adaptations have to have a heritable variation. So you have to have different forms of adaptations that are able to be passed down at the genetic DNA level from parent to offspring. Therefore, the ones that survive can pass on that trait to their offspring. You have to overproduce offspring, because the mechanism for variation is mutation. And the more that you have, the more mutations can happen, the more heritable variation you can have in a population. This is also going to produce competition for resources, then allowing for nature to select the better trait, not the perfect trait or the best trait, but the better trait in that population. So natural selection is going to change allele frequencies over time in a population. So if you start with an initial population where you have equal amounts of alleles, over time, that if natural selection is happening, you are going to have a different frequency appear in the genes, in the allele frequencies, which also then is going to be represented by phenotype frequencies. Allele frequencies will then change the phenotype frequencies. So if there are certain alleles that have a favorable adaptation, they are going to be passed on more so. And again, alleles are going to code for traits, which are your phenotypes. So natural selection can work in a stabilizing selection manner, meaning that you are going to choose for a better average trait, that the environment will choose for the better average trait and decrease the fitness on both extremes. It might select for both of the extreme traits, but give an unfavorable advantage to the average trait. Or it could select for one of the extreme traits in directional selection, and it will select against the other extreme trait. And over time, these will change the phenotypes of the population. If enough change occurs, then this is going to lead to speciation, or the creation of a new species over time. In order for speciation to happen, species have to be reproductively isolated. Because for biology, species are groups of individuals that can reproduce to create fertile, viable offspring. So in order for that to be prevented, you have to enter into reproductive isolation. That might be behavioral and a wrong song. That might be temporal and making gametes at a different time than another species. Or geographic, where there is literally something in the way that's preventing two populations from meeting and mating. But natural selection is not the only way in which allele frequencies can change in a population over time. These can also happen due to random events, and this is called genetic drift. So, two examples of genetic drift. One is a bottleneck event, and this one might happen where there is a sudden fire that comes in and destroys most of the population, and the allele frequency of the surviving population is different than the original population. Or founder effect, where you have a group of a population go to establish a new colony in a new location, but again bring with them a different frequency of alleles than the initial population. For both of these, genetic drift is going to have a much larger effect on smaller populations than larger populations. The evidence that we have that evolution is occurring and has occurred: fossil record evidence. We can use this for dating to figure out with the law of superposition how old different fossils are. Older fossils are going to be on the bottom, newer at the top. We can even look to see that species have changed over time based on the remains and leftovers from prehistoric species. We can look at homologous structures, and these are going to be structures that came from a common ancestor, although they can have different functions now, but that they are going to develop from a very similar gene. Again, similar gene, but different functional structures now. Vestigial structures are a form of homologous structures. And again, they're remnants and show common ancestry, but we don't use them anymore. So think your appendix. You don't need it. You can remove it. It is a leftover. We still have it because it hasn't been selected against through natural selection. We can see that heritable change can cause differences in species through selective breeding and artificial selection. We can also see other observable changes, especially with bacteria resistance to antibiotics, that allele frequencies can change and then phenotype frequencies can change in a population. But our best evidence definitely is the comparative DNA and protein evidence. The more similar the DNA, the more common the ancestor. The less similar the DNA, the more distant the ancestor. So we can do this with DNA as well as protein, although DNA is better than protein. But we can then look at the differences and we could plot them out on something like a cladogram that we could then see where those evolutionary events have taken place. So it's going to show common ancestry. DNA explains how genes can change over time with mutations that are passed on. And it also shows this connectedness through which all life shares a universal genetic code. I hope this helps. Have a great day.